This program is part of a series of winter workshops and presentations that began in 2021 and explore the lives of coastal women through textiles and handicrafts in the Penobscot Marine Museum collection. Penobscot Marine Museum is dedicated to preserving and sharing the stories of the variety of people who make up the rich cultural heritage of Mid-Coast Maine. What were their lives like? By examining the object, exploring its history and what we know about the person who may have used it or made it, and even through actually knitting, sewing, tatting, or making a new piece based on the original, we connect to these women across time. In 2021, we started by exploring fishermen's mittens in our collection. And then in 2022, we found out about Abby Clifford's stockings and also Henrietta Gary's dress. And looking at these garments created more questions than answers. And you'll find that out even more tonight. Often limited information is included when items are donated to Penobscot Marine Museum, and this is true of most museums. We are able to find facts about these women from newspaper articles, books, and other primary sources. We're able to fill in some gaps with written stories and pictures documented by other women of experiences that would have been similar between women, many women at that time. The garments themselves are more personal. Someone created that. Someone made decisions to add this here or change that there. Someone wore that. For what life events, for what daily boredoms. It's fascinating. I really enjoy it. And this presentation in particular is going to share the story of wealthy Pendleton Nichols Poor's life and also explore the intersection of life at sea and the handicraft of tatting. Information in this program comes from a variety of sources. If you're familiar with the stories of Searsport sailing families, you'll likely recognize some names. And if you do have any additional information that you feel would add to this presentation, please contact me at my email, which is jganskop@pmm-maine.org. So our adventure tonight starts with this bonnet in the Penobscot Marine Museum's artifact collection. And so here's a nice close-up look. You can see the scallops at the edge of the bonnet, and there's a variety of different tatting patterns, and there's these really nice lace insertions. They would have been sewed onto the tatting. And now we're coming around to the back of the bonnet, the very center. It's made out of this cream-colored cotton thread. And we did see at the edge, there was also a blue silk ribbon on either side. And we're coming over the top of the bonnet again. And down the other side a little bit. It's just a fabulous thing to find in the collection. And there's that blue silk ribbon at the bottom. The bonnet came to the museum in 1999 when Phyllis Poor of Belfast, Maine, donated her mother-in-law's wedding dress to Penobscot Marine Museum, along with a pair of shoes and the tatted lace bonnet that were presumably also from the wedding, although we don't know for sure. Wealthy Pendleton Nichols's wedding to Frederick R. Poor took place on January 2nd, 1907 at the home of her parents at 40 High Rock Street in Lynn, Massachusetts. According to an article in Belfast Republican Journal, the bride was charmingly attired in a gown of patterned lace over white silk and carried a bouquet of bride roses. After they were married, Fred and Wealthy settled in Belfast, Maine, where Fred ran a pharmacy, and they had 2 children, often visited or were visited by friends and family, and they were active in the community. And the part that makes this extra important to us is Wealthy spent part of her childhood at sea as part of one of Searsport's seagoing families. Born to Delphine Pendleton and George Amos Nichols in 1883 in Searsport, Wealthy's father and grandfathers were Searsport sea captains. This photo from 1891 shows Wealthy's mother's aunts and uncle. And I believe Wealthy's mother, Delphine, is up here at the top left corner. Wealthy had 4 brothers. Her sister, Lilias Lewine, was born at sea in 1880 off the Cape of Good Hope. Like many other Searsport and Maine merchant captain families, Wealthy and her siblings likely alternated between going to sea with their family on board the ship Abner Coburn, which is pictured here, and staying home with relatives to attend the local school. Life at sea meant visiting ports around the world and exciting adventures. It included also a lot of time in the relatively small space of the cabin and deck of a sailing vessel, so Wealthy and her siblings would have learned to entertain themselves. So looking at this photo of a painting, Wealthy's family would have largely, they would have had their living quarters back here at the back or stern of the vessel in the after cabin. And so now let's take a look at what that space would have looked like. This photo is of a different vessel and a different family. But the rooms where Wealthy and her family would have slept and passed their time on board the Abner Coburn would have looked similar to this. During bouts of bad weather, Wealthy's mother and siblings would have been largely confined to the dining room, sitting room, and bedrooms included in the captain's cabin. And if the thing that caught your eye as soon as you saw this picture was the piano, and now you're wondering, wait, did they have pianos on board sailing vessels? The answer is yes. There were many pianos that went to sea. That seems like a lot of effort, but it would definitely be nice to have something familiar when you're sailing around the world. So this space would have been kind of a sitting room area, and then there was also a dining room that the mates would also have used. And then off of this main room, there would have been staterooms where they would sleep. And it was, furnished pretty comfortably, kind of like home, but a little bit different because your lamp is gambrel, and that way it's going to rotate with the rolling of the ship. So what was the storm like for the family of a captain? To illustrate this, consider this passage from the novel Shipmates, written by another child of a Maine merchant captain. In the story, Elizabeth and Captain Jim are newly married, and this is Elizabeth's first sea voyage. Elizabeth sewed and read, had dinner, sewed and read. Her husband, Captain Jim, was on deck most of the time, for the steward's prophecy about the weather proved true. It did grow worse. When she heard shouts and sounds, she mounted to the companionway skylight. From there, she watched the spectacle of more struggles with larger surfaces of canvas. It was intoxicating to watch the dark blue, almost black water rip by to the leeward, nearly at the level of the deck, with a rush like an organ note. In fact, every ship sound and storm wail blended in a sonorous anthem of power as the sky darkened. The next morning and all day, the ship rolled and lunged tremendously, and the storm howled. Meals were consumed anywhere that seemed reasonably stationary, but not without numerous catastrophes. Jim was absent except for short periods. Elizabeth heard the mate or second mate come and go with equal swiftness. Only she and the steward had time to spare. During the night, she roused from uneasy sleep to Jim shedding his oilskins and boots and flinging himself on the sofa. "Aren't you coming to bed, Jim?" "Nope, just got time to catch a little snooze." "Has the wind changed or something? The ship feels different." "Hove to." Elizabeth lay awake for a time, listening to Jim's heavy, regular breathing. The ship was hove to. She did not know how that was done, and she had missed seeing it. Apparently, it was deed of some finality or need, bringing snoozes to tired men. You hove to and got a snooze, and then you unhove to. Elizabeth giggled sleepily and dozed off. Throughout 2 more days, the vessel bucked at great seas with most wearying plunges and jerks. It was lonely in the cabin. One tired of running up to look through the skylight at the rain blowing in sheets and at shining oil-skinned figures, at the few shreds of sail in the tossing gray sea sizzling and foaming like a kettle. That excerpt was from Shipmates by Isabel Hopestill Carter. And the storm described in that passage was rough, but didn't result in too much damage to the vessel or to the people on board, but it does give us an idea of what it would be like. So now back to Wealthy's story. Life at sea brought inherent danger. Wealthy's oldest brother, Hugh, was washed overboard and lost at sea in February 1896 when he was the mate of the Abner Coburn. The following year, on March 24th, 1897, when the Abner Coburn left New York, Wealthy's mother was aboard with Wealthy's sister, Lilias, and her 7-year-old brother, Amos, on a trip to Hong Kong. Wealthy's older brother, Joseph Field, was the second mate on that voyage. Wealthy did not go on that trip. It's unclear if she stayed with relatives in Searsport, but in the middle of July, Wealthy was definitely here in Searsport because she took a vacation to Swan Lake with a group of friends. They were chaperoned by Mary H. Nichols, who would have been a distant cousin, and other girls in the group included Annie Moulton, Henrietta Gary, Iona Nichols, Louine Nichols, Florence Colkard, Edna Black, Maria Gilkey, and Jessie Black, and they were mostly teenagers. This photo of a sunset on Swan Lake is from Penobscot Marine Museum's Eastern Illustrating and Publishing Company collection. Swan Lake is about 8 to 10 miles northwest of Searsport and continues to be a popular recreation area today. A week after what must have been an enjoyable summer trip with friends, Wealthy received terrible news. On June 19th, the Abner Coburn had run into a gale. Remember the description of the storm at sea that we just read? Imagine Wealthy's mom, sister, and little brother in a space like this pictured here, listening to the wind and the rain with the ship rolling in the waves. Their father, Captain Nichols, was going up the companionway, this staircase that led from the living quarters up to the deck, when suddenly the ship was hit with a large wave. It smashed the wheel and hurled their father down the stairs, presumably also bringing a lot of water down into the cabin. He died 8 hours later from his injuries. Wealthy's mother, sister, and little brother returned to the United States by steamship, landing in San Francisco in September and making their way back to Wealthy on the East Coast. After that tragedy, Wealthy's mother settled the family in Malden, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. Wealthy and her family continued to return to Searsport each summer to visit with friends and family. As she had the summer her father died, Wealthy took drives and week-long trips to Swan Lake along with a group of girlfriends, including several other daughters of Searsport sea captains. And this is a picture of Searsport about that time. At this point, the age of sail was coming to an end. Searsport shipyards had built their last vessel in 1891. After generations of building wooden vessels and sailing around the world, Searsport captains and sailors had to transition to steam vessels or find employment on land. But it wasn't sudden, and over those generations, many Searsport families had developed strong personal and business ties in big port cities like Boston and New York City. By 1900, many Searsport natives and descendants of Searsport families were living and working in these cities, like Wealthy's family, and they would often return to their ancestral homes in Searsport for vacations and to visit friends and relatives. They might have traveled by steamboat, as you see in this photo, or they could have also taken the railroad. A gathering of these Boston area transplants occurred in 1901 when over 300 people gathered at the Quincy House, a downtown Boston hotel. Wealthy's mother reconnected with another Searsport native then living in the Boston area and married Edward Billings in 1902, later moving to Lynn, Massachusetts. Wealthy attended Malden High School and graduated in 1904. She went on to study at the Chandler Normal School in Boston and later got a job as instructor in stenography in the high school at Concord, New Hampshire. Several girlhood friendships continued into Wealthy's adulthood, emphasizing connections between Searsport, Boston, and the sea. Elva B. Prescott, who grew up in Searsport and continued to spend her summers there, was bridesmaid at Wealthy's wedding. Henrietta Mindoro Gary, who attended the earlier Swan Lake trips and lived in Searsport, regularly exchanged visits with Wealthy. Does that name sound familiar to you? If that name sounds familiar to you, it may be because she was mentioned during Penobscot Marine Museum's previous textile series when we examined the dress worn by Henrietta Gary during Christmas and Boxing Day in Australia in 1885. Henrietta was pregnant with her daughter during those holidays. The baby was born on board the ship SF Hersey as it sailed through the Straits of Mindoro, hence the younger Henrietta's middle name. Wealthy's friend Henrietta married a Searsport sea captain in 1915. You have to wonder if their shared backgrounds at sea contributed to this friendship that they maintained. So now we've come full circle back to Wealthy's wedding in 1907. And I will read the full article from the Republican Journal. An elaborate home wedding occurred at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Edward B. Billings, 40 High Rock Street, Wednesday evening, January 2nd, when their daughter, Miss Wealthy P. Nichols, was united in marriage to Frederick R. Poor, a businessman of Belfast, Maine. The nuptial knot was tied by Reverend Charles F. Whedon, pastor of the Central Congregational Church, within a bower of ferns, potted plants, and other floral decorations. The bride was charmingly attired in a gown of patterned lace over white silk and carried a bouquet of bride roses. The bridesmaid, Miss Elva Prescott of Chelsea, wore a becoming dress of pink silk and carried a bouquet of roses. William H. Hall of Belfast, Maine, acted as best man. Over 100 guests were presented to the young couple at the reception, which followed by the ushers, Amos Nichols, a brother of the bride, and Harold Williams. Miss Nina F. Poor was in charge of the guest book. The young couple were the recipients of many valuable gifts. Guests were presented from Boston, Malden, Chelsea, Belfast, and Biddeford, Maine. After a short wedding trip, Mr. and Mrs. Poor will reside in Belfast, where the groom is the proprietor of a successful pharmacy. In this photo, you can definitely see the delicate pattern lace mentioned in the newspaper article, which is very different from the tatted lace in the bonnet. This is really delicate and dainty. The tatted lace is pretty nice, but this thread that was used is relatively thick. We don't know if Wealthy made the tatted bonnet, and actually, even if she did wear it at her wedding. However, considering tatting takes few supplies and they take up little room, and tatting is fairly time-consuming, it would have made an ideal activity to take up during long days at sea. It's easy to imagine Wealthy as a young girl or teenager tatting her own lace on board the ship Abner Coburn. How did captains and their families pass their time at sea? Joanna Kilkard offered insight into that in her article, Domestic Life on Sailing Ships. She wrote, many shipmasters, particularly those who made long voyages alone, developed hobbies. Captain Andrew S. Pendleton was a master hand at making net lace. He finished a bedspread each voyage. Captain David A. Scribner's specialty was macrame lace. Captain Joseph P. Sweetser became more than an amateur painter of marines. Captain Walter M. Mallet was a camera fan way back in the gelatin negative days. Captain Edward Payson Nichols carried a printing press, and he and his family got out a periodical called Ocean Chronicle, which is a graphic and interesting record. Captain H.A. Sterrett, in command of the first ship Frank N. Thayer, during a period of 7 years, labored over a large rigged model of the vessel, which he kept set up in the cabin. The list of shipmasters' avocations might well be extended. Isabel Hopestill Carter was writing fact, not fancy, when in her fine book, Shipmates, she presents her shipmaster hero as expert in tapestry needlework. Indeed, in Shipmates, after finding out that Captain Jim did needlework and even assisting him with it, our leading lady Elizabeth reflected on how she should spend her time and the captains she had known growing up. She must think up a hobby for herself. She didn't like to embroider or crochet, but she must have a hobby. When Jem read aloud, she could be busy instead of sitting with folded hands. Old Captain Blake used to potter in his garden in the summer, and in winter he knitted socks and mittens. And John Carter, when he came home from sea, painted sea scenes in oil. Terrible they were, but he did love them. Captain Thatcher, they say, made hooked rugs of yarn, and Captain Larrabee did embroider. Yes, she needed something to do. As you can imagine from these excerpts by women who spent part of their childhood at sea, it was important to find ways to occupy the time during long voyages at sea. Although tatting is not mentioned in either of these sources, it is worth exploring further. Tatting is a handmade lace composed of a repetitive series of knots. It may have evolved from fishermen's nets or sailors' knots. It occasionally shows up in sailors' decorative knot books. For example, here are instructions on how to tat included in the book Knots Useful and Ornamental by George Russell Shaw, which was published in 1924. Sailors refer to the tatting knot as the lark's head knot, while in tatting it is referred to as the double stitch. By the late 1800s, it was a fairly popular variety of handiwork. Tatting could be used as a decorative border for clothing and linens and for collars, as well as larger projects like baby booties, handbags, and bonnets. I made a GIF. This is a demonstration of the tatting double stitch. It's split into a first half of the knot and a second half of the knot. And in each case, the tatter adjusts tension on the string to flip the stitch from the shuttle string to the working string. Tatting is composed of chains, which are seen here in purple, and rings, which you can barely see here in green. It's mostly pinched beneath my fingers. Tatting is usually done with patterns that are either written out or drawn out with diagrams. And patterns were included in ladies' magazines, standalone booklets and books, and advertisements from thread and shuttle companies. The device used to make tatting is called a shuttle. Tatting shuttles vary in size depending on the preference of the tatter. Tatting may have also evolved from an earlier handicraft called knotting, which also used similarly shaped shuttles, but they were bigger. Tatting shuttles typically fit in the palm of your hand, but the knotting shuttles kind of stick out from your hand. Here's a 20th century steel shuttle with a tatted small circular motif. And this motif is made entirely with rings, no chains. And as I zoom in, you can make out those knots that it's made out of. Tatting shuttles in the late 1800s and early 1900s were typically made from hard rubber, shell, silver, and bone. And here we have another intriguing intersection with life at sea and sailors. Like Wealthy and her family, sailors also had free time to fill while on long voyages. In addition to decorative knotwork, sailors, especially those on whaling ships, are known for their bone carvings or scrimshaw. And this is a bone tatting shuttle from my personal collection. And you can really see the beautiful decorative carving. There's this flower in the middle and leaves, and then there's even this texture in the background, and it is a double-sided tatting shuttle. The downside to this is there's not a lot of room to put string, but it certainly looks nice and it feels nice in your hand. It has a good weight to it. That I know of, we do not have any tatting shuttles in the collection at the Penobscot Marine Museum, but I'm curious, so I've been surveying online artifact collections from Northeastern maritime museums, and I found some exciting examples of tatting shuttles. In the Mystic Seaport collection, there is a bone shuttle made by a man named Fred Smith. It's very similar to the one that I just showed you, and it's great that we know the name of the person that made it. We don't often have those details, so it really brings it to life. There's a person behind this piece. My favorite find in this survey is an even more beautiful shuttle, and this is in the collection of the Nantucket Historical Association. It is made of whalebone with silver and tortoiseshell inlay. And even better than its physical beauty, we know that the shuttle was made by a sailor on board the whale ship Aurora for the captain's wife, Melvina Pinkham Marshall, between 1856 and 1861. And I definitely have a little more research to do because I want to know if Melvina was actually a tatter. There are other examples of simpler bone shuttles in museum collections, and there's also probably likely many more that are not included in online catalogs. Tatting shuttles and examples of tatting may also be labeled as something else. While tatting can be found at many museums, many antique stores, and probably more of your grandmother's closets than you might expect, it's a comparatively rare handiwork that not many people know much about, but it is all over the place. In our upcoming workshop, the project inspired by Wealthy P. Nichols' tatted bonnet will take a close look at the tatting in the bonnet, and we'll also recreate parts of the bonnet into circular motifs and bookmarks. So if you register for that program, your kit includes all the materials you need to start tatting and to complete these small projects. There is room for more research on the connection between tatting and life at sea. I would love to find a letter or a diary that describes tatting on board a sailing vessel. It's exciting to draw connections and inform our understanding about the people who lived in our area over 100 years ago. It's been a pleasure sharing what I found with you this evening. Thank you so much for joining me.